right, so the Bears finally, I guess, made their coaching hires. If you watched episode 3, which is on the Bear Report YouTube channel, you'd realize that we had the JT Barrett scoop before anyone else did, so we should definitely be getting credit there. Anyone who went to JT Barrett's Instagram saw it said QB coach at Chicago Bears, screenshotted it and uploaded it to Twitter, was not the first to break the news. It was actually us on this show. What's up, guys? Welcome into the Halas Beat YouTube show brought to you by the Bear Report. Usayd Koshul, Nick Whalen here. You can check us out on Twitter at Usayd Koshul, at _Nick Whalen. Dude, it's been a while since we last recorded, but there's a lot of different things happening for the Bears.
Yeah, it's been exciting, to be honest, because, initially the last episode, I think, was Ben Johnson. We got him. And then it's like, okay, well, how's the rest of this staff come together? What's it look like? And from everything that I've seen in terms of the hires that we'll get to, I've been very positive on them for a multitude of different reasons. I think it's a good blend. And seeing Ben Johnson pull in, I think, the level of coaches that he has and a bunch of different levels, I think speaks to the excitement of what he brings to the table, but also this team's talented and people want to be around Caleb Williams.
Yeah, and you mentioned the talent part there. Like half of, I think, maximizing your talent and roster and building a winning program isn't just winning the games. Like we were talking about this before the show in regards to places we've coached before, but it's like a lot of it just comes down to the fact that can you get every coach and player in the building, as well as like your front office people, speaking essentially the same language so that they know what the standard is top to bottom. I mean, some of these hires, let's be honest, right? Like we expected Dennis Allen to get hired. JT Barrett, we knew being the assistant quarterback coach for the Lions was likely going to be the guy that's coming along for a promotion, just because that is natural succession right there. Obviously, I don't think, at least to me, Al Harris wasn't a surprise. Declan Doyle was a bit of a surprise because I'm like, whoa, 28-year-old. But I mean, Sean Payton has this thing where he just loves to hire younger coaches in their early 20s, and then they work their way up through the ranks. And all of a sudden, Declan Doyle is basically Joe Brady 2.0.
Yeah. Well, and then Antoine Randall, I think, was a good get too. I mean, again, you have essentially two guys that know the Lions system with Ben Johnson, so that way, like, it's going to be, not that everything's going to be the same, but they know how Ben Johnson works. They know what, things he likes in meetings, things that he likes to get prepped. Like all of that, I think is nice transition. Plus, I mean, you saw Antoine Randall deal with the chaos that is Jameson Williams, the very up and down, and developing, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and they got Tim Patrick, midway through the year, and that worked out well. So you see the development piece, and that's pretty exciting. But the Declan Doyle is probably the most interesting, and people always talk about his age. I'm a little partial to him because he was a student assistant at Iowa. That was his first gig, and I was a student assistant at one point, but he's a grinder. And there's kind of two different ways you could go with an offensive coordinator that isn't going to call plays. You can hire somebody that's going to be older, that's an upgrade. We talked about Hank Fraley, et cetera, or it's a young guy that isn't going to leave right away. And he's just going to grind. And I think that's the path that Ben Johnson went here.
Yeah. And the Doyle hire is, to me, it gets really funny, right? Because you're talking about like, oh, this guy's whatever, 28, 29 years old, right? Like the Bears have hit on the next Sean McVay. I think to me, right, like when I see the Sean McVay argument, the way that I look at it is I'm like, listen, let's be honest, right? Number one, age does not matter anymore. The hiring trends across the league have changed to the point where people don't care about, and teams don't care about age anymore. They just want to find the best candidate possible that's going to help their team win games. Like that's what these owners and GMs want. I mean, you go back 10, 12, maybe even 15 years at this point, and there was a point where you had to be in your early 40s, maybe even early 50s to be able to even get a chance at a head coaching gig. Yep. The Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, Matt LaFleur hiring cycle, like those guys all got hired within a 2 to 3 year span, kind of turned that whole thing upside down. And then the trend kind of went away for a couple of years, and now we see that it is certainly continuing to go ahead and come back. And so, like, to your point, I mean, the Bears don't just see Declan Doyle as this sort of, hey, like, you're here for a year, and then you're gonna go get a OC job where you get to call plays under a defensive minded head coach. Like, that could happen, but the Bears are really thinking of giving Ben Johnson a student that he can grow under.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And everything that I've read about him is he's someone that's super detail oriented, someone that's a student of the game that's always had to kind of learn because he didn't play college ball. And so, I think that's another part of this too is, the work ethic part of this versus someone that gets handed something, I think is something that's really appealing, at least in my eyes. And then, I mean, JT Barrett being a former quarterback is kind of the opposite end of that. But again, has to have the work ethic or Ben Johnson wouldn't have brought him along. So it's kind of interesting. You have like the hasn't even played college ball guy. Then you have three former players, right? Or no, it's two former players three. Randall L, JT Barrett, Al Harris, all played in the NFL. So you kind of have both parts to it. I think it's kind of a nice little mix. And then you have probably my favorite one, former head coach, Dennis Allen, defensive coordinator, has been successful. I got some stats for that I'll bring up here in a bit, but having someone he could lean on potentially, but also, and we talked about this, I think on the last episode, Dennis Allen can't leave. Basically, I mean, he's not going to get another head coaching gig. He's going to be the Steve Spagnuolo to Andy Reid, but he's going to be like that to Ben Johnson because he's had 2 shots at head coaching gigs, hasn't worked out, and he's I would say top 10 defensive coordinator in the NFL.
Yeah, to your point about JT Barrett, let's kind of call it how it is. And I kind of smile and I chuckle as I'm going to make this comment. But hey, you couldn't make it work with a OSU quarterback. So you brought in the next best thing, which is a former OSU quarterback to coach your quarterbacks. And you hope that he certainly pans out. Because let's be honest, like when JT Barrett was at Ohio State, a lot of people were like, oh, this is a guy that is a really intriguing option as a player. But to your point about Dennis Allen, so this is a hire that you really have to love, right? Like you mentioned Steve Spagnuolo, and Spags was a head coach for the Rams about a decade ago at this point. But to me, what makes the Dennis Allen hire so interesting is that there are going to be those comparisons to Spagnuolo. I mean, watching those AFC championship games yesterday, let's call it how it is. Forget the refs and the Bills. The Chiefs have this theme where you could legitimately argue that as much as the credit goes to Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid, Steve Spagnuolo is a legit difference maker because he knows how to dial certain pressures up and call the game based on certain situations. Now, I don't mean to go on a tangent about Spags here, but looking at Dennis Allen's time in New Orleans under Sean Payton, looking at Dennis Allen in Oakland with the Raiders, you certainly see a lot of the exact same as well, where the guy's a defensive guru. And, with this hire, probably the most notable thing is he's going to keep that 4-3 personnel intact. So Ben Johnson's basically saying, listen, we're not going to go ahead. We're not going to overhaul the defense or change the scheme. We're going to change certain things, but we're going to keep it what it is for the most part in terms of the personnel.
Yeah. So to get into some of those numbers. So one person broke down Dennis Allen's EPA per play, success rate, and dropback EPA per play over the last 3 years. And some of that's after he wasn't even there. So that would be like with the replacement guys for New Orleans this last year. But he was 10th in EPA per play, 4th in success rate, 9th in dropback EPA per play. And then also some stats. Since 2017 to 2023, none of Dennis Allen's defenses have ranked lower than 14th in points allowed. So basically he's a top 10 guy all the time. Interestingly enough, Ben Johnson over the last 3 years, EPA per play, 3rd. So like you're getting potentially 2 top 10 play callers on both sides of the ball to help reboot this thing in Chicago.
So, last week we went ahead and we discussed players that could take a step forward under Ben Johnson. How about under Dennis Allen? Because I look at this and I'm like, traditionally, when we look at the types of players that have found success for a number of years under Dennis Allen, Cam Jordan's a name that comes to mind. He's been in the league for forever at this point, is 36, 37 years old, I think, showing no signs of slowing down. A guy that's going to be in Canton pretty soon. You look at some of these linebackers as well, been really successful. I would even say Chase Young is a name, but I really look at Dennis Allen and I say there's two guys right now on this roster, Javon Dexter, Montez Sweat, that are going to end up having real breakout seasons with how aggressive Dennis Allen loves to be.
Yeah, those are two good names. Another two I'll bring up, one because of Dennis Allen and one because of Al Harris. So we need to see some positive from Tremaine Edmonds. Like, my goodness, $18 million per year. He's made some plays, but he's not played up to that contract. I would say not even close to that contract. And so I would look for, because Demario Davis was an amazing linebacker for Dennis Allen in New Orleans for years. And, he had him, he had Pete Warner, and then you're seeing a guy right now, Zach Bond, who is doing awesome with Philly, couldn't even get on the field because those two guys were just being awesome with the Saints. So you have a group of linebackers that are continually doing well. We know TJ Edwards is a stud. Let's get Tremaine Edmonds to take a step. And I think that would be huge for the defense because you have some of these other pieces in place. The other one I would like is Al Harris, who developing corners over there in Dallas has gone well. I mean, Trevon Diggs, awesome. Jerron Bland did well. I mean, they both were up there in terms of like interceptions and, some of the best DBs in the NFL when they're healthy. They get hurt a little bit. Are we going to get anything from Tyreek Stevenson development wise? Or is he going to be somebody they're not going to put up with him and he's gone and it's going to be Terrell Smith or someone new's going to come in there? But I think developing that other corner opposite Jalen Johnson would be huge for the defense, because if you do that, then you have to throw at Jalen Johnson. Then you can't just pick on one side, which is what we saw in like every third down.
Yeah, and I will go ahead and I'm going to add this in. I had this tweet yesterday during the game and during the AFC Championship game. And, Matt Milano has been freaking amazing in Buffalo, like over the last couple of years. A guy that went from undrafted free agent to just a all-pro / perennial starter. I mean, it is not hard to see why Buffalo let Tremaine Edmonds walk, because they're essentially getting the same production. You could argue even more out of Milano for a fraction of the price than they would have gotten out of Tremaine Edmonds. But, talk about the cornerback room. I mean, Al Harris, let's be honest, he is a former Packer. So he knows a little something about constantly beating the Bears and what it sort of takes. You look at his background, like he's had a pretty solid run under Dallas in terms of just being able to go ahead and, develop those cornerbacks, as you mentioned. And then the guy's bounced around in a few different spots, right? So, like, he was with the Dolphins in 2012 under, you guessed it, Ben Johnson was there, or he might have been there around the same time. Well, yeah, so Ben Johnson was an offensive assistant in 2012 with Miami, and then Al Harris was an assistant there as well. And then you kind of look at him, right? Like, he went to Kansas City, right? Was there for a couple of years until about 2018, and then made the leap back into the league in 2020 as a DB's coach, but was also a assistant head coach in 2024 under Mike McCarthy. So the greater point I think here is just the Bears hiring practices are so interesting, because it's like, you interviewed Ben Johnson, you hire Ben Johnson, and then you're going back about 15 years at this point to bring in Al Harris, who consequently was with Ben Johnson in Miami for a year. Then you go ahead and you interview Mike McCarthy, who so-and-so, right, ended up basically having Al Harris as his assistant. So this whole thing is completely looped in and intertwined. And then to your point, right, like the Declan Doyle and the Dennis Allen, like two guys under Sean Payton, they also have some familiarity with Dan Campbell. So it's the approach that they took with his hiring cycle was incredibly unique to where they were doing their homework on these candidates without actually having brought them in.
Yeah. Yeah. That is very true. And it seems like it's a different process than what they did previously, or polls did previously, and then you just did this last cycle with offense. So hopefully it's a little refreshing having some camaraderie a little bit more instead of getting bits and pieces all over the place. Which brings me to some potential other coaches that could get hired. Okay. One of which is one that you mentioned, man, our last episode, as potential offensive coordinator from Detroit. So the rumor is Detroit is going to have Johnny Morton be the offensive coordinator and not Tanner Engstrad, who was their passing game coordinator, which means Tanner Engstrad, does he want to be the passing game coordinator still in Detroit under a new OC that he doesn't know? Or does he want to come to Chicago and be the passing game coordinator?
Okay, that is an excellent question here to me. And I look at it and I'm like, if you are Engstrad, you're kind of looking at this thing in terms of your career, but also like realistically, which team gives you a better shot to get on the map? Like, let's call it how it is. I think that the Lions crumbled in that playoff loss to Washington, but they were missing pretty much their entire defense outside of some of their safeties, right? Like Aiden Hutchinson had been out the whole year. As soon as he went down, they found a way to get around it. But again, he's someone that I look at and I'm like, okay, well, Tanner Engstrad, what exactly are you trying to do? Because you're talking about a guy that is in his early 40s, right? You're talking about a guy that has clearly put his work in, and then you're also talking about a guy that has gone ahead, and since John Morton is now your OC, what specifically do you want to do? Are you really looking to take a step forward and end up with a team like the Bears that are going to give you a chance to really vault yourself into OC conversation, even though you may be making a linear move and be passing game coordinator? Or do you want to go ahead and you kind of want to stick it out in Detroit, hope that next year at this time there's a chance you're getting hired? I would say if you're Engstrad, you are looking at the possibility of taking the gig that the Bears offer you if they offer him a gig. Because if you're him, you're looking at this and you're like, wow, I was in Detroit for a couple of years, right? Like I got there in 2020. I've been there since 2020. I worked my way up, went from being offensive assistant all the way over to pass game coordinator. Well, you really telling me that you passed up on me for someone else?
Right. Right. I mean, I'm sure that hurts too, and so that's kind of where I'm at, because they brought in, remember, Thomas Brown was passing game coordinator, a heavy hitter. So that's still a possibility. Another heavy hitter before we go to O-line is, so David Shaw was linked to potentially being the offensive coordinator. I heard rumblings, I don't know if this is true or not, that he could potentially be like an offensive assistant or a senior assistant with Chicago, which I think would still be an amazing get. I don't know if that would happen or not.
Yeah, that is one that I struggle back and forth with, because it's like David Shaw primarily has been on the map because of the work that he did at Stanford. Now, his time at Stanford didn't end the way that a lot of people hoped to, but let's call it how it is. Like, for a school that's in the conference that they were, Stanford found a way to be competitive under David Shaw. But I will say this, him working under Sean Payton in the Denver front office presents this sort of really interesting question here. Hey, maybe he does want to get back into the sidelines. Maybe he eventually wants to get back into coaching, and so the Bears offer him this ripe opportunity. Or is he so done with coaching and the hours that go into it that he's like, you know what, I would much rather go ahead and continue to work in football, but I want to go ahead and just have a say in developing a quarterback.
Mhm.
Like it's interesting because you talk to people, and anytime you talk to anyone that has been in or around college football, anyone that has coached football, I mean, David Shaw is a name that I quite frankly am surprised he has not gotten a head coaching gig yet. But again, like there's instances where teams bring him in for interviews and then he just sort of drops out of the race and is like, this isn't something I want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is peculiar. I think he deserves another job. Which brings me to we're talking about these connections, right? Like there's the Saints group, then there's this Lions group, and that's where a lot of the guys are coming from. Um, Brad Biggs has brought up this name multiple times. Is Dan Ruchar, who is a very highly respected offensive line coach, was with Dan Campbell and the Saints for 10 seasons, where he's regarded as one of the better O-line coaches in America. I mean, he's not at, you know, Philly or Bill Callahan or Detroit, right, level, but he's right below there. And right now he's at Tulane for the last couple of years. And he thinks that could potentially be the Bears O-line coach because there is the connection with the Saints.
Yeah, that is Richard's a guy that I had to do some sort of research on, but you're talking about a guy that went to high school in Clinton, Iowa, played college football at Northern Illinois, and then from 1995 all the way till about 2004, he was a offensive coordinator slash line coach. He was a tight ends coach. He was a running backs coach, at NIU plus U of I. And yes, he's kind of bounced around in a handful of different places. So here's what I'm going to say about Ruchar. He to me is like the Harry Hines stand, right? Of today's NFL. A guy that kind of has gotten the most out of his O lines wherever he's been at the college and at the NFL level. I look at him and I quite frankly say when he was in New Orleans for all those years, like Alvin Kamara, really good. Ryan Ramczyk, really good. Andres Pete, really good. They had really good offensive lines when he was coaching them up in New Orleans. But I think to me, the big difference that Ruchar brings to the table that a lot of these other coaches don't in terms of who's going to be your O-line coach is the fact that the guy knows offense because he's coached so many different positions. You're talking everything from QB to tight ends, right? Which congrats to Thomas Brown for getting that Pats tight end gig, by the way, all the way down to running backs. So when people hear the term, well, football's a game that starts and ends in the trenches, right? Like you hear that phrase. I mean, you have to have a really good O-line coach to be able to have a really good offense. As generic as that sounds, that's a tale as old as time that is never going to get old.
Well, didn't we just see that? I mean, we talked about Spagnuolo, which, by the way, I think he won the last Super Bowl almost by himself with how good that defense was. And then you look at Jalen Hurts, who I think had like all day to throw. It seemed like with that Eagles game. So it's night and day. We saw what happened with Caleb and before that Fields, where it felt like these young guys didn't have time back there to process and figure out, what defenses are trying to trick them into. So I think it's a huge hire. It's a crucial hire. So I would be very, very for that. Some other things that are kind of interesting is as you're trying to fill in these other spots is there's a handful of coaches that weren't necessarily dismissed and they could come back. So that would be tight ends coach Jim Dre, D-line coach Travis Smith, who I would like to have him back, I think. Linebacker Dave Borgazzi and safety coach Andre Curtis. Those are some of them, at least, that weren't dismissed yet, so they could be retained.
Yeah, see, those names all of a sudden, I think, get interesting. Like looking at Jim Dre, let's call it how it is. Like, I think that Cole Kmet's a really good tight end. Cole Kmet obviously is not as dynamic as some of these guys like Brock Bowers or Travis Kelce, but Cole Kmet does enough to get the job done. To me, part of the dysfunction with tight end this year is that the whole offense didn't work, which took away production from a lot of the Bears vets. I am going to go ahead and say this, though. Andre Curtis is a name that there's a legitimate chance where if Kevin Byard's back next year, because the Bears could, I think, save like $7 million cutting him, plus Jaquan Brisker, if he's back healthy, then the Bears could have one of the better safety tandems in the league. You start to kind of look at a guy like a Travis Smith. I mean, Travis Smith, learned primarily under Rod Marinelli plus Matt Eberflus, right? And Travis Smith, I don't think gets as much credit as he should for the way that he's kind of gone ahead and made the Bears, D-line somewhat effective, And again, like, he was an assistant D-line coach from 2020 to 21 with the Raiders. But I think the greater speaking point here is it's like if you are a guy like a Ben Johnson, you may not want to go ahead and start all over again, right? If there's certain positions on the roster that you feel like, such as safety, that are legitimate strengths, maybe you do look into bringing those guys back. Jim Dre has a lot of different experiences, so maybe you look into keeping him just because he is so familiar with Cole Kmet.
Yeah, and going back to Travis Smith too is, when you look through, defensive linemen that they have right now, I think DeMarcus Walker is playing near some of his best ball of his career. We know Andrew Billings is. Javon Dexter has developed. Darrell Taylor, at certain spots was playing amazing. Montez, I think, was banged up this last year, but the year before was playing really well with Travis Smith. So you go through of some guys that didn't develop. I would say Zach Pickens, certainly. But, there's a lot of position groups in this team where you could be like, man, they could have got more out of that position group than they had. There wasn't a lot of juice to squeeze, you know what I mean? Because that was not a super talented position group. Because we're like, man, we need another D tackle, we need another DN. That's just what we always talk about in terms of, besides O-line, D-line, something we need. But until they got beat up and lost Billings, like, they were kind of holding their own. So I think that speaks a little bit to his ability. The other thing, man, we only have a few minutes left. We can't forget to touch on, we retained Richard Hightower, which I think at times people are like, well, Cairo Santos' range and the blocked field goal, and people were all down. But I think there's some good, vibes after that point about Richard Hightower, which I believe the Bears were 5th in EPA per play on special teams. The Green Bay game, right, was awesome. But we also can't forget the onside kick that we got to force overtime in that comeback against Minnesota. Because how many onside kicks do you get? So that's something that you practice and you've worked at, and things have kind of come together. So I think that, and plus, what was it, Detroit or Green Bay? One of them, Detroit or Minnesota, the getting into range and hitting the field goal, right, to go into overtime. So you have all of these plays that I think should supersede, hey, a blocked kick, because some of those things can kind of happen.
So I'm glad you brought up Richard Hightower, simply because he sort of slipped my mind. But it's fair to argue that of the Bears units, offense, defense, special teams was the best, plus also the most consistent unit in 2024. A lot of that goes to Torrey Taylor, which last year, like when the Bears spent that 4th rounder on Torrey Taylor, I remember sitting in the media room at Halas Hall, and people are just losing their mind over, like, well, why would you spend a 4th round pick on a punter? Let's call it how it is. Like, a good punter flips the field and then pins offenses deep into their own territory, to the point where, like, you basically are making offenses have to drive the length of the field to score. And there were times where that Bears special teams plus defense work together. Go ahead.
Right. Sorry to cut you off. Did you see the EPA for punters this past year? Have you just seen the chart?
I have not seen the chart, so you're gonna have to send that my way, so I'll look at it.
So Torrey Taylor, he definitely had some great punts, but I don't think he lived up to what the expectations we had for him. I think he was maybe like 10th or something in EPA per point. But our punter last year, Trenton Gill, y'all, last in the NFL again. So I remember seeing an article, and whether you believe, this is all true or not, but, one net yard gained per punt, I think it was one is like 0.3 points or something. And so calculating that out over a season, the difference between Gill and Torrey Taylor was like 6 points. And you think of it, that might be like 1 or 2 games. And I think there was a massive difference because can you imagine getting like every time you punted 3 or 4 less net yards this season? Like it's massive in terms of field position, and that leads to points.
Yeah, that is a really good point. Like when the Bears moved on from Gill and then drafted Torrey Taylor, it was kind of this like, hey, we want to go ahead. We certainly want to upgrade our punting unit because we don't think it was good enough. But Richard Hightower is another guy that never got the credit he sort of deserved for how good the Bears ended up playing, right? Like, especially with special teams, because you traditionally look at a lot of the places that he was at. And I think what was very clear to me is that even when he was in San Francisco, when he was with the then Washington Redskins, now Washington Commanders, when he was with the 49ers from 2017 to 2021. Like the guy went ahead and had, really good runs. And in 2016, when he was with the Bears, like as an assistant special teams coach, like he ended up, pretty much being a solid assistant as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to find the chart and I couldn't find it. But no, I agree with you. And plus there's something to say for having someone on staff that you keep in a role kind of like that, where it's important, that can also let them know, hey, these are some things that have gone well. Instead of it being Poles or someone else, it's someone there that's done well, and you keep them around for that aspect, but also for the player aspect of like, hey, listen, remember Jalen Johnson, Cole Kmet, some of these guys that got extensions. Like, if you do the right thing, we're going to keep you around too, and not just we're just going to dismiss every coach because the new head coach is here.
Absolutely. That I totally agree with. Anyways, we've hit the 30-minute mark, so we're going to get out of this place. Make sure you're following us on Twitter at Halas Beat. Make sure you're checking us out on Twitter at Usayd Koshul, at _Nick Whalen. A lot of really good Bears content coming up here over the next few weeks. I know the Senior Bowl, with how crazy things have been with these coaching hires for the Bears, has kind of taken a back seat, but we'll be discussing some draft prospects, some potential guests coming on the show over the next couple of weeks as well. Make sure you like, rate, subscribe to the channel. Leave us a comment as well. Love to interact with you guys. Other than that, have a fun and safe rest of your week. We'll see you all on Thursday or Friday morning. And bear down, ladies and gentlemen.